Alright, thanks for stopping by on this video today. If you can tell from the title, this is going to be kind of a throwdown between the Canon EOS M50, yeah it is an EOS, and the Sony RX100 Mark V. Now I believe that these cameras are the closest that I can get between a good comparison between the Sony RX100 line, because the Sony, I believe after the Mark V, so the 6.7, I think there's an 8, the f-stop increased after the 5th iteration. So right now I have a 1.8 on this camera, and I think after that they bumped it up to like a 2 point something. I don't remember what it is. But this camera should be better at lower light than the later iterations of the RX100s. I believe it's on par with the Sony ZV-1 right now. I believe the ZV-1 actually uses the lens from this camera. The only real difference between those cameras is that the ZV-1 is cheaper, and I think it's a little more focused on vlogging and video content creation. But besides that, it should be pretty similar. Canon, I have a Sigma 1.4 aperture lens, so that's going to be amazing in low light, which I love this lens. It's one of my better purchases for this camera. Right now you're kind of seeing the differences between the cameras. On the Canon, I have it at f1.4 with a shutter speed of 1/60th, and the ISOs are at 200. On the Sony right now, I have the aperture at 1.8, ISOs at 200, and I believe the shutter speed is at 1/50th. The thing about the Sony is when you put it in video mode and you put it on aperture priority, when you go to 1.8, it kind of automatically sets the shutter speed for the camera. I'm also recording on 24 frames per second on both cameras, so everything should be as identical as I can possibly get them to be, with the difference being that the Canon's at 1.4 while the Sony's at 1.8. Also, one difference that you'll see is that the Canon, you'll probably see like a wider field of view versus the Sony where it's a little more punched in. I believe the Sony is at a 22 millimeter equivalent, 22 or 24, and the Canon's at 16 millimeter. But there is a little bit of a crop on the Canon because I do have the electronic stabilization on, so it does punch in a little bit. When I'm looking at the viewfinders, actually it looks like they're about the same. I do have the Sony slightly further back. It's not really that much. It's actually a little bit further than an arm's length versus the Canon, which is pretty much an outstretched arm length. So if I were to bring the Sony in a little bit closer, right now the Sony is at arm reach. So this is more of what you'll be looking towards when it comes to the Sony RX100 Mark IV. When it comes to the Sony RX100 Marks 1 through 5, plus the Sony ZV-1, this is arm reach. So it is a little bit of a tighter picture versus the Canon, which is wider, even with the electronic image stabilization on. Now for the Sony, I believe it does have image stabilization. I'd have to double check and make sure. Video is actually pretty good whenever I'm walking around. Canon obviously has electronic image stabilization, and there are lenses out there that you can get for this camera that have optical image stabilization in it. Unfortunately, this lens does not, but the kit lens that this camera comes with does have optical image stabilization. And that is this 15 to 45 millimeter lens. It is, I believe, an f3.5. Oh yeah, it says it on the actual top. So yeah, it's an f3.5 lens. Doesn't do as well in low light as like the Sony and this new lens that I got for the camera. Now price wise, you're looking at about $700 if you get the ZV-1, or like $500-ish if you get the RX100 Mark V camera, versus the Canon where you can get it for like $550 with the kit lens. And if you want to have a better lens that's an aperture of 1.4, you'll be spending about an extra $400, putting you at about $1,000. So the Canon setup is a little bit more expensive than the Sony, but honestly I really like the Canon setup a little bit more. I like the wider field of view and a better low light performance versus the Sony. But on the other hand, I do like the Sony's lightweight capabilities versus the Canon's. Sony is definitely a lot lighter than Canon with this lens on there. The Canon with the kit lens is a bit lighter, but I still got to give it up to the Sony RX100s and the ZV-1s because it is lighter and easier to carry around. You can even fit one of these in your pockets versus the Canon where you definitely cannot fit that in your pocket. Now for 4K video recording, that's a bit of a toss-up. There's pros and cons between both cameras. I think the Sony's 4K is better because I believe when you're in 4K, it'll still have the autofocus versus the Canon where you lose I believe it's the dual phase autofocusing. I don't remember the actual technical term for it, but you do lose it when you go into 4K with the Canon. But on the other hand, the Sony, if you're recording in 4K, you only get about 5 minutes of recording. You have a 5-minute time limit, plus you have the added crutch of it cutting off early if the camera gets too hot. And that is one problem I have with the Sony, is that it can overheat a bit sooner than the Canon will. Now let's get into kind of more of the broad daylight kind of capabilities of these cameras. Now obviously at 1.4 on the Canon, you're going to be very overexposed unless you put on an ND filter. I think I am a little bit overexposed right now, so I do have this handy ND filter that I'm going to slide on right now. And the thing is, having an ND filter for your camera is an extra expense that you would have to get for your Canon, so that will also bump up the price of the Canon a little bit more. Alright, so now the ND filter is on, and I have to say this is probably a pretty bad example of how an ND filter would work in broad daylight. It's Washington and it's winter time. I'm not going to see any like sunlight like you would in California for a while now. But you can raise the ISOs, make it a little bit brighter, not too bright. I think 640 is not too bad, right? 640 ISO, not too bad. Now I can also raise the ISOs of the Sony. I don't really think I need to, but the neat thing about the RX100 Mark V, I'm not sure if it's in the other versions or not, or the ZV-1, is that it has a built-in ND filter. So if I just go to the menu, I'm gonna go into settings, and there's an ND filter option. Turn it on. Now my picture is a lot darker. So what I'll do is now go into my menu and also bring up the ISOs a bit. So I have the Canon at 640, so I'm gonna put this at 640 as well. Now this is the ND filter on the Sony. Now when I'm looking at the viewfinder, I do think it does look a little bit better than what I'm seeing in the Canon. On the Canon, I can see the window in the background is super overblown versus the Sony where it's not overblown at all. I can actually see the house on the Sony instead of the Canon. But the Sony is still a little bit dark, so I'm going to actually bump up the ISOs a little bit more. So now I have the ISO on the Sony at 1250. You can tell me what it looks like, if it looks a little bit more grainy than the Sony does. It still does look a little bit dark on the Sony versus the Canon. But the thing is, with the Canon, I can also just lower the ISOs a little bit to 500. It's close to being the same. It's still a little bit darker on the Sony, and the Sony is at a lot higher ISO than the Canon is. And I think that's in part because the Sony is at an f1.8 versus my lens on the Canon, which is at an f1.4. So scientifically speaking, I should get less noise on the Canon than I would get on the Sony right now with the ND filters on for both of them on a minimum setting, because I'm pretty sure there's only one setting for the Sony. And like I said, the ISOs is at 1250 on the Sony, 500 on the Canon. So tell me what you think. I still think I might like the Sony a little bit more. I'm not sure how grainy it is. It's kind of hard to tell on a little screen, but I can definitely still see the house in the background on the Sony versus the Canon where I cannot see the background on the house at all. But on the Canon, I can also adjust the ND filter. So let's put it about, let's see how many stops that is. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think it's 5 stops. I'm not really sure what the lingo is for the ND filters, but I do have the filter a little bit darker now. Now the Canon's at 1250 ISOs as well. Still can barely see the house. I'm starting to make it out now, but you can definitely see it a lot better on the Sony than you could on the Canon. But they are both at the same ISOs. Like I said before, Canon's on f1.4, Sony's on f1.8. I have the aperture set, so they're not changing. The only things that aren't changing are the ISOs. So let's see if I can darken the Canon up a little bit more. Now I have to raise the ISOs a lot more. Now I can definitely see that the Canon is a lot more grainy, and I'm at 12,800 ISOs. So I don't like that. Let's lower the ISOs a bit. Now it's at 6400. Let's lower the ND filter. Still a lot of noise, a lot of stuff going on. Let's drop it down to 3200. Let's lower the ND filter. And see, the thing is, with the Canon, I have the ND filter pretty low. I can finally start seeing the house, but I'm definitely a lot darker. But it does seem like the exposure of my face is about the same as the Canon now. But I can still see the house better with the Canon. And I actually think that might be because of the bokeh effect. There's a lot more bokeh with the Canon than there is with the Sony. The Sony is not that blurred out in the background, I don't think. So there's that. Tell me what you think about all the scientific stuff down below. Like I said, the Canon right now is at 3200 ISOs. Sony is at 1250 ISOs, both at their lowest aperture. Sony at 1.8, Canon at 1.4. Shutter speeds 1/60th on the Canon, 1/50th I believe on the Sony. It automatically adjusts to the aperture. Both are recording 1080p, 24 frames per second, so everything is about as identical as I can get it to be. So now I'm actually going to put the Canon back in a decent place. And let's lower the ISOs to, let's say 640. All right, so lowest ND variable filter setting, I don't know what it's called. I think it's like the stops or something, but it's at the lowest setting. Can't see the house in the background. Sony, you can see the house in the background, but I think the Canon's a lot more bokeh, blurred background-esque than the Sony is. I'll have to see in post-production, post-editing, but yeah, I really like it. That's the differences. Tell me what you think down below. So I'd like to talk about kind of another pro of the Canon versus the Sony. With the Canon, you can also get like a mic attachment for it. Sony, I don't really think you can, especially for the RX100 Mark V. I don't see like a microphone input anywhere on the camera. There is like an HDMI port and a micro USB port, but no microphone. But no head jack port like there is on the Canon. So I do have a mic on the Canon. I can put that in here. Now hopefully this works. I did turn the mic on just now. I honestly think that just the base Canon audio is better than the base Sony audio. I'm gonna try to remember to kind of change out the audio as this video is going so you can see the difference between like the audio on the Sony versus the Canon. But now the Canon also has a microphone, so it should sound even better now. Tell me if you can even hear the difference of the audio down below. I'm not too sure if I can hear the difference between the Canon's internal microphones versus the actual dedicated microphone. But it is one thing you can think about when it comes to these cameras. They can be around the same price. Canon obviously is a little bit more expensive when you get all the attachments for it, the extra stuff. But that means that the Canon is a lot more customizable than the Sony is. Plus, I think the Canon has a better battery life than the Sony, so there's also that. But the Sony is obviously lighter, a lot more compact, take it anywhere. You can just point and shoot, it's very easy. Canon, it's a little tougher when you start implementing some of your custom stuff onto it. Stock Canon M50, I think is great for video when you're vlogging or doing some talking head pieces. Unfortunately, I think the kit lens is not that great unless you're in like perfect, great lighting. Which is something I'm never in, so that's why I got this new lens. So yeah, tell me what you think down below, the differences. If you have any questions, ask them down below. I'll do my best to answer them. Otherwise, I might make a video following up on those questions if I get enough of them. I'm sure one thing people would like to see is what it's like to walk with these cameras, like what the stabilization is like. So let's get these cameras off the tripods and test it out. All right, so immediately, like I've said before, Canon's a lot heavier than the Sony, but the Canon, I also have a wider field of view than the Sony. So this is kind of going in a dark area. I should actually probably take these ND filters off and kind of test what it's like. But what do you think of the stabilization? I think it's pretty smooth when you're just like walking around, and if you end up going into a darker spot, this is kind of what it looks like. And again, this is with the ND filters on, fairly high ISOs. So now let's try this again with the ND filters off. Alright, so ND filters are off. I'm hand holding the Sony. I have it at actually 400 ISOs now, and the Canon's at 200 ISOs. Still at the lowest apertures, 1.4 for the camera, 1.8 for the Sony. Walking around. Whew, I will say that my arm is definitely getting more tired carrying around the Canon than I am with the Sony. And looked like at one point the Sony was actually doing better in low light than the Canon was. So I guess tell me what you think of the picture quality down below. Definitely getting a shoulder workout. So yeah, that was a quick vlogging test of the cameras, recording on the Canon M50 now. Tell me what you think down below with the stability and kind of the changing of the lighting. I noticed that when I went from these like okay lighting to low light, the Sony seemed to have done a little bit better in the low light than the Canon did. The Canon looked very underexposed, but I do have the Canon at ISOs of 200 versus the Sony, which was at 400. But I think even at that point, with the aperture of 1.4, it should have done a little bit better. So I was a little bit surprised about that. Anyways, that's going to be the end of this video. I have plenty to edit now. Catch you in the next video. I might think of something else to kind of do a comparison of. Maybe like some photography stuff, I don't know. Anyways, catch you in the next video. Peace.